you have dabbled around with so many different historical eras and you've taken so many different classes. Is there one favorite historical era person or an event that appeals to you the most, that you always go down this rabbit hole when you start reading about it?
I don't know. I think immigration history is really fascinating to me. Immigration history, specifically in the United States. Yeah. Part of this is I feel like I get very combative because people will often say, this might get a little political, I apologize, but people will say something along the lines of, why don't people come here legally the way that they did when they came through Ellis Island? Yeah. And I'm like, have you looked into how people came during Ellis Island? Because first of all, Ellis Island opened up in 1892. It was the very first federal immigrant processing center in the United States. Mm-hmm. If it was the very first federal immigrant processing center in the United States and it opened up in 1892, did we have immigrants before? We did, but people never think that we didn't really have any sort of processing prior to 1892. 1892, we set restrictions for the first time. We had to have questions. But then we get to 1924 when the Johnson-Reed Act was passed. That was when we set quotas for the very first time ever. And I don't know how deep you want me to go into these quotas. Yeah. On Ellis Island alone, mm-hmm. and there were more immigrant processing centers that opened up after Ellis Island. On Ellis Island alone, you could have as many as 10,000 immigrants a day processed on just Ellis Island. 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act was passed. We set quotas. The number of total immigrants from the entire globe that could enter the United States was cut down to 150,000 total. So just think about how many fewer immigrants could come in 1924 than in 1923. Yeah. If you went from 10,000 a day just at one immigrant processing center. One of the ramifications of this was leading up to World War II. There was a German banker and war vet who applied for a visa for himself and his family several times, never received it. His name was Otto Frank. You may have heard of his daughter, Anne Frank, and you can imagine how differently her diary would have turned out. Now, the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 has thankfully been repealed. But between 1924 and 2023, there have been so many different immigration laws, Supreme Court cases, and just learning about all of them is mind-blowing and fascinating. And I find, especially now, that people are really interested in their own genealogy, how your own family came over. My last name is Marod, which is Syrian. They came over in 1904. And just knowing, whether or not they were considered white or not white in 1904. And there were several Supreme Court cases that changed and how different they would have been received if they came over in 2023. So I find that's very personal to a lot of people, to me, and I just find it's fascinating. So that's one where I think I'm like, immigration history, give me more stories of immigrants. I recently learned that Salvador Ferragamo of Ferragamo Shoes was processed on Ellis Island, just like all the people who were processed on Ellis Island. So I feel like that's my current rabbit hole subject.